Hello, this is Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You remember the Wizard of Oz, and Dorothy said if you click your heels 3 times and say, I want to be home, you get home, something like that. And of course, it's an allegory about the gold standard. How apropos. Anyway, just repeating the same mantra over and over again has magical impacts, Stacy.
Yes, it has magical impacts throughout history. Of course, during that time was a period of time similar to what Ray Dalio says we're going through again today, the 1920s to 1930s. And one of the theories of propaganda that emerged during that time is if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. So with that in mind, here's a tweet from Paul Krugman, Nobel Economic Laureate. Debt is money we owe to ourselves. Debt is money we owe to ourselves. Debt is money we owe to ourselves. Debt is money, ... It only makes us poorer in aggregate if it crowds out investment, which isn't doing.
You see, the Tin Man, the Straw Man, the Cowardly Lion, Dorothy, or a Munchkin. But Paul Krugman is making a couple of bold statements there. Number one, that we only owe money to ourselves. And number two, it's not crowding out productive investment. Okay, this is, of all the outrageously moronic things this guy has said, this has got to take the cake.
Well, of course, on Twitter, if people write in all caps, usually that's a sign of they're not very well up here. So I think he seems to be doubting himself. Even he leaves an exit at the end, which when he misspells, if it only makes us poorer in aggregate if it crowds out investment, which isn't doing.
Right, of course it's crowding out investment. We've got a country, as we've covered many times, it's a dysfunctional emergency room that takes up 17-18% of GDP, disguised as a country. We've got a crumbling infrastructure, roads, bridges, tunnels are not working. We've got students that are massively in debt and probably will never add to the productivity of society, all because of this the propaganda that debt doesn't matter, we just owe it to ourselves. But of course, he's failing to mention that as a baby boomer who came into his career when interest rates were 16% on the 10-year note, thanks to Paul Volcker. He's ridden the wave of lower interest rates this entire time and pocketed that money handsomely. And he has a temerity to say he's a victim also, because this truth is so unpalatable to the unwashed that he would make more money if he actually told the benefits of what would be a non-Keynesian approach to the economy. But he sticks with his Keynesian approach and he takes the cut and pay over at their New York Times because I'm a victim. I'm Paul Krugman. All these flashy economists out there that are actually talking about the real economy are getting paid more than I am, and I'm such a victim. I'm Paul Krugman.
Baby boomers, so what age were they in 1971 when we went off the gold standard? Well, they were like 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old. They were the first in on this pyramid scheme that became this global fiat system. So of course, they're going to love this system. You don't want it to end. They've had free money forever, but debt is money we owe to ourselves. And what he's saying, he's not saying ourselves, the baby boomers. Ourselves, he's saying the Generation Z and some of the millennials. So millennials are now putting everyday items like shoes and sweaters on payment plans. Of course, this is a layaway plan that we all know here in America. If you grew up during the 70s, you went to Sears and you put things on a layaway plan, right? Usually to buy a washer or dryer or a big item for your home, your sofa, refrigerator, things like that. Well, here, millennials are now doing that with sneakers or shoes or a sweater. So they're putting it on a layaway plan, a $100 item. And this is a result of this pyramid scheme where the mantra has been said for the last 40-something years, debt is money we owe to ourselves. Debt is money we owe to ourselves. Really, 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 it is, it is.
Yeah, not to mention 30% of it or more is foreign creditors. So it's not even statistically or factually correct. He's just like repeating the same boulder dash over and over again, hoping nobody mentions or understands or notices that it's completely nonsensical. And he's bankrupting the current generation. Yeah, he's a guy who got in early on the Ponzi scheme, and he's pushing this meme that debt is only something we owe to ourselves. It has no consequences financially, even though you see the financial problems developing with your eyes if you're opening your eyes. People open defecating in San Francisco and Los Angeles as the infrastructure of society collapses because the investment's been crowded out by the rise of the engineered rise in asset prices due to the manipulation of interest rates lower, as we've been talking about for quite some time. But he seems to think that, I happen to have some assets that went up a lot in price, therefore I must be right. And the fact that I've essentially caused an enormous dislocation and enormous poverty. Remember, infant mortality rate in America is up.
Yeah,
life expectancy is down.
This is how pyramid schemes get sold. MLM schemes, all those multi-level marketing, Ponzi schemes, is because there are indeed genuine winners. And that if you're in first, you are a winner. And of course, they believe it. They believe, no, kids, why are you being so negative? It's so easy. But I mean, I am Generation X after Paul Krugman of he's the baby boomer generation. I know for a fact my costs of going to university at UCLA were a lot cheaper than what they are now. I was able to pay for my rent. I lived on my own, pay for all my books, and I was an English lit major, and that's a lot of books, pay for university, all working part-time at a stationery shop in Brentwood. So I could do that then. Could anybody do that now? No, but I did have to pay it, like I couldn't put it on a layaway plan. I didn't take out any debt. So in a way, it seems easier to most young students now. It's like, oh, I'll just take out a $100,000 loan to take out the next 4 years, and then you emerge into this burden of debt that never goes away in a deflationary environment.
Right. I mean, just swap out Paul Krugman's words and put in, how Bernie Madoff would say this. The 1% return I get every month for 25 years is money I pay myself. The 1% I make is money I pay myself. The 1% I make is money I pay myself. That's Bernie Madoff. So Paul Krugman is saying Bernie Madoff was a genius. Bernie Madoff and his Ponzi scheme are the example of how you should run the U.S. economy, even though it's causing like I said, I mean, does this guy read the other parts of the newspaper that talk about infant mortality rising, life expectancy declining, open defecation in major cities across the nation? Does he even? I mean,
this is the sign of guilt as well, I think, because there are these things called affirmations that a lot of people with too much time on their hand tell themselves. Like they feel guilty, so they tell themselves affirmations. I knew a person who inherited a huge fortune. And this person then spent all their time telling themselves that I deserve this wealth. I am worthy of this wealth. I am better than most people. This person literally had to tell herself that all the time with notes all over the house and stuff like that. So here, again, let's look at some of the consequences. Debt is money we owe to ourselves. Debt is money we owe to ourselves. German banks start passing negative rates to retail clients. Now that Germany's second largest cooperative lender has started charging retail customers to account for negative interest rates, other German banks are warming to the idea, Bloomberg says. Berliner Volksbank is applying a negative 0.5% rate on deposits of more than 100,000 euros. Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank indicate they're considering similar moves. Germany's banks have resisted passing on negative rates to retail clients, but have run out of ways to offset the effects on earnings. So they're coming for, this is customer A and customer B. They're both German. They are ourselves. This is debt we owe to ourselves, debt we owe to ourselves. Well, the two people are ourselves, person A and person B. And person A has the savings account with 110,000 euros in it. And whoops, we're going to take some of that to pay off all the bad debts of customer B. That's what he means when these are debts we owe to ourselves.
Right. And of course, that's degrading the savings of the economy. It's also causing massive kind of non-productive of the economy. And I mean, this is, it's only getting deeper with these negative interest rates are only getting more pronounced. They're coming to the U.S., as many of our guests have predicted.
Yes, Mark Yusko said recently that 38% of the companies on the S&P 500 cannot meet their current debt obligations from current earnings. So because they just rack up debt, because debt is money we owe to ourselves, and they just keep on paying it to stay flat. Of course, that is the mantra, of course, of fracking as well. Like, they have never made money in 10 years, but they just keep on saying, debt is money we owe to ourselves, and drilling, and they're never going to make money, but they keep doing it. And that results in things like this headline. The repo market is one of the many side effects of the insane belief from central banks that they can create enormous distortions in markets and somehow prevent the collateral damages. Create a tsunami expecting to manage the wave.
Yes, indeed. They're creating a tsunami of bad debt and expecting they can manage the results of this catastrophic natural disaster. And this is a financial disaster due to the financial pollution of all this junk debt that's been pushed into the economy and causing massive dislocations. And the most appalling thing that Krugman is saying there is that the debt hasn't pushed out the productive economy. When we know when JP Morgan is now being investigated for criminal racketeering, and that's the biggest bank in the U.S. That's the result of interest rate manipulation and this mantra of we only debt that we owe to ourselves. Jamie Dimon is now being investigated as a mafioso criminal racketeer, and the New York Times and Paul Krugman is giving him his blessing. It's disgusting.
So, let's continue on this topic of debt is money we owe to ourselves, and the fact that the central banks and the likes of Paul Krugman, these economists that work for the central banks, they hire thousands of economists who spend the day sitting in a room at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, of St. Louis, of San Francisco, of Atlanta. They sit in these rooms and they say, debt is money we owe to ourselves. Debt is money we owe to ourselves. And they write it on the chalkboard, and this is what they do all day long. And they must, you see this reflection, a fractal of everything around us. Our geopolitics is a reflection of our central bank policy. We've created these monsters of debt. And we keep on telling ourselves, it's just money we owe to ourselves, right? It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And they keep on doing all sorts of QE4 intervention in the repo markets, asset purchases, all sorts of stuff, negative interest rates to try to control the disaster, the intervention they had before. Well, we've intervened all over the world geopolitically to sustain also the global economy and our corporate, profit levels. And so every intervention leads to another consequence and another nation we must invade and another, so we have these like monsters everywhere we look, holding together this fragile economy with too many interventions, and one has to fail and the whole thing comes down.
And there's Paul Krugman cheerleading on the sidelines.
Yay! Woo!
Alasdair Macleod, who's a fan favorite, will be in the second half. Don't go away. Stay right there. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to fan favorite Alasdair Macleod of goldmoney.com. As always, full disclosure, I am an investor in this company. Alasdair, welcome back.
Hello, Max.
All righty, let's get into this. So, Alasdair, Nobel economist Paul Krugman says that debt is money we owe to ourselves, and he keeps repeating this like a rhesus monkey over and over again. Debt is money we owe to ourselves. He's had some kind of nervous breakdown or what have you, but he keeps repeating this over and over again. What is he trying to say there? Your thoughts?
Well, I saw the tweet as well, and my response to it was he's got to believe that, because without believing that, the whole of any argument he has just falls apart. I mean, what he ignores is the fact that, debt is owed by different people to different people. And, a debt is a debt. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Right, but, it seems pretty, these debts are being pushed onto future generations. As we talked about in the first half of the show, the current generation and the future generations are having to inherit this debt. So it's not debt that they owe ourselves. I mean, it's debt that they have to be cleaned up by the future generations. So he's just he's kicking the can down the road in a most kind of greedy way, Alasdair.
Precisely that. He obviously works on the basis that he thinks debts never need to be repaid. And in a sense, this is what people think. They take out debt and they don't think it needs to be repaid. And the people who are most guilty of that, of course, are governments.
Right. And of course, I don't understand why he keeps repeating this mantra. It's some kind of self-hypnosis, I guess. But as you point out, if they were to shatter the illusion here, their whole paradigm would crumble. Now, let's move on to German banks for a second. They are now passing on negative interest rates to their retail customers. you've been warning about this for a while. Isn't this
Yep.
what Paul Krugman is talking about? Customer A is made to pay the debts of customer B through essentially wealth confiscation. The bank's simply doing wealth confiscation for one guy and giving it to another guy, Alasdair.
No, you're absolutely right. Negative interest rates basically rob the saver and pay the borrower to borrow. I mean, it's complete lunacy.
Right. So let's talk about European banks, because I guess the idea was these negative rates are going to help European banks, but in fact, they're hurting European banks. And if it's harming the banks, why do they keep doing it, even if the Bank of International Settlements just reported that the bond buying programs are distorting markets, Alasdair?
Well, I agree with you entirely. I mean, if it hurts when you bang your head against a wall, stop banging your head against the wall. I mean, it's complete lunacy what they're doing. And I mean, we know that reducing interest rates doesn't work, but it plays to this idea that interest rates are an unnecessary cost for borrowers, for progress, however you want to define it. I mean, that's complete nonsense. Interest rates reflect the future possession of goods compared with current possession. It is time preference. But of course, central banks don't understand that. They merely think it is a cost of money. They think it is usury. They would rather do away with interest rates completely. They have arrived there. And whether, of course, they find that there are consequences, I'm afraid we're all going to find that out in the next year or two, or probably even the next month or two. I mean, this thing is speeding up quite rapidly, I think.
Yeah, let's talk about your latest piece. And your latest piece, your research can be found on goldmoney.com. And these are must-read pieces, especially in these times where you've been talking about what we now see unfolding. You've been preparing folks for it. Now it's all happening. You predict an inflationary depression. How is that even possible? Aren't all depressions deflationary?
Well, no, it depends how you define deflation. I mean, deflation it should be the contracting quantity of money. But of course, it's used to define, if you like, an implosion, a slump in business activity, which is actually a very different thing. You can quite easily have a slump in business activity while the purchasing power of the currency goes down the toilet. And that, I'm afraid, is what we're likely to see, because the central bank's response to a slowing economy, an economy that's threatening to move in towards a slump because of the credit cycle happening at the same time as the trade tariff war between America and China, the response from central banks will be to print, print, print. And one of the things that they will do at the same time is they will reduce interest rates to the lowest level of possible in order to inflate asset prices, in order to inflate the value of government debt. And it'll work for a brief period of time, but sooner or later, people will wake up to what's happening to their money, and they won't buy the government debt at 1.5% for 10 years in the case of America, or minus whatever percent it is in Germany. They'll stop doing that, and they will realize that actually government debt is only as good as the promise from government. And when they begin to doubt that promise from government, then we're all going to be in deep trouble.
Right. So it sounds actually like stagflation. As I understand stagflation, you have a business slowdown with prices going up. So that sounds like stagflation. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this is what we saw in the 1970s. An oil price was going up due to the big oil embargo, causing prices to go up, but it caused the economic activity to slow down. Is that a fair comparison?
Well, I mean, you may call it stagflation, but if you look back to the Weimar Republic, I mean, those are exactly the conditions that they had at that time, and we should worry about that.
To get our terms correct here, I mean, every time we talk about, and this applies to all conversations about inflation and deflation and stagflation, and how do you define these? Is it the quantity of money entering the system? Is it prices of stuff at the cash register? This idea of inflation, I'll throw in another idea here, inflation versus hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is when trust in the currency evaporates. Weimar Republic comes to mind. So people just don't trust the system anymore. That would be hyperinflation. So if I'm correct, and that's when you see currency collapse. And so the primary currency that seems to be under the gun right now, the one that's in the crosshairs more than any other currency, would be the dollar, right?
Yes. Well, I mean, all the major currencies are in the crosshairs. I mean, if you look at the rate of growth of money in China, for example, that's been running at a compound rate, I estimate, of about 12%. In the US, it's been running at about 9.5%. I'm including, incidentally, the money not in circulation, which is basically the balance sheet of the central bank. The rate of increase in Japan is somewhat less. I think it's around about 4 or 5%, and it's the same sort of rate in the Eurozone. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Eurozone and Japan have been pushing on a bit of string. They've reduced interest rates to negative figures. You would think if Keynesian economics had any relevance in the real world, that the rate of expansion of the money supply in Japan and Europe would be considerably greater than it is, say, in China, which has the highest interest rates of the four, and America, which has the next highest of the four. But this is not what's happening. I mean, the fact of the matter is they will print. They don't understand that printing does not work. All it will do is it will buy time for businesses which are on the verge of bankruptcy. And the important point to realize about this inflationary depression, if you like, is that we are moving into a slump. Borrowers who are marginal, if you like, in terms of profitability, are finding that life is getting more and more difficult. The banks are loaded up with junk debt. And put all this together, what happens? People start backing off. And when the banks start backing off from the marginal borrowers, the junk, the rated junk, then I'm afraid that the whole thing snowballs. And I really do think that we are potentially on the edge of that chasm.
All right. Now, you mentioned Weimar Republic. Your thoughts, let's talk about Ray Dalio. I'm sure you read his stuff. He's runs the biggest hedge fund in the world in Connecticut. He's very prolific, puts out a lot of research. He said we are entering a similar period, and the result will be similar to fascism, communism period of the 30s. So he's making a big analogy between the 1930s and current situation. Your thoughts?
Well, I think he's right to compare the economics with the 1930s with one big exception. In the early 1930s, we had sound money in the form of gold. The dollars that you used were exchangeable into gold before 1933. So it was sound money, and that is why prices collapsed. This time it is different. Every time there's just the threat of what the central bank has called deflation, you will find they just print. The result at the end of the day is more likely to be a Weimar-type situation where they had no backing for the currency and they used it as a means of funding the government deficit, just like in America today, just like in the other nations as well. But using it for that purpose basically means that you do degenerate into a hyperinflationary situation. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is that government liabilities are rapidly escalating. You may recall back in 2012, Lawrence Kotlikoff worked out the net present value of America's future welfare liabilities, we're talking about healthcare, pensions, and so on and so forth, was $220 trillion. Now, that was the highest estimate of the lot. But if you just pause for a moment and think how that is calculated, it is calculated on the basis of current interest rates. Now, if we're going to see interest rates go to zero, then effectively those long-term liabilities become infinite. And someone should surely wake up and understand the arithmetic of this. It's actually quite a crazy situation.
Well, of the insulting things that Krugman tries to tell us, one of the most egregiously, outrageously, and unbelievably unhinged from reality is he claims that good businesses are not being crowded out by all this cheap money funding all these banks, instead of allowing it to flow into the real economy. And that's just so horrendous to make that comment when clearly, I'm sure from where you are over in the UK and from where I am in the US, all I see are zombie corporations and zombie banks being fed by this cheap money, and all the productive capacity of the economy is definitely being squeezed out, Alasdair.
Yes, I mean, the political consequences of hyperinflation or, a real loss of purchasing power of currency is going to be extremely unsettling. And just bear in mind what happened in Europe in the 1930s. I mean, the comparison we've got to look at perhaps more is what happened in Germany than, if you like, what happened in America.
All right, let's pick it up there on that point in another segment. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report, Alasdair.
That's my pleasure, Max.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Alasdair Macleod of goldmoney.com. If you want to catch us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.